So hi Emma, and welcome to the show. Really excited, to have you join us because, talking about trauma is not easy for anyone. So I really, really appreciate that you've been willing to talk about this, and hopefully you can, I guess, explain to us, first of all, what made you want to share a little bit about your story. What were you hoping would come out from that for others?
Thank you for having me and for the opportunity. I think for me, going through trauma was quite challenging, and I would love to be able to provide information or ideas or just any real support for people that might need it, because I definitely felt like I needed that.
So, I mean, as much as you feel comfortable, do you want to just share this part of your story that you feel comfortable sharing in terms of those traumatic events that led up to depression or anxiety for you?
Absolutely. So it was quite a complex situation, and my eventual diagnosis was PTSD and anxiety.
Yeah.
It predominantly revolved around unsafe home environment where there was elements of domestic violence going on. And then on top of that, I had miscarried one of my children, which was quite heartbreaking. And then I was pregnant with my youngest. And for me, her pregnancy was normal for me, but when it got to the end, there were complications, and I ended up having a C-section that was I didn't have an appropriate spinal. It wasn't, it didn't take properly. And so her birth was incredibly traumatic, I felt.
You want to sort of share as much as you feel comfortable about sort of what was happening in your home life.
I fell pregnant with my second after the miscarriage, and the miscarriage really exacerbated the unstable behavior that was happening at home with my then husband. That wasn't anything physical. There was no actual physical abuse, but there was a lot of verbal, emotional, financial, and some other stuff too. And that was hard for me to understand what was happening at home and reconcile it. It was like the miscarriage propelled that behavior and intensified it like tenfold. And so what was behavior that I could normally sort of explain and manage became behavior that was like in my face, not okay.
Right.
And so not only was I miscarrying, I was also trying to get my head around what this behavior meant. And there was a lot of blaming on me. Like I was constantly being called crazy and psycho, and I was told that I needed to be locked up in a mental institute pretty much daily.
Wow.
The irony of all of that was eventually it propelled me to get grief counselling. And during that grief counselling, there was a lot of conversations, and in those conversations came sort of the dialogue around perhaps this is not a normal, healthy relationship. Perhaps this is a domestic violence relationship.
Right.
And I think I was in denial for a long time. And during that period, I got pregnant with our second. And it wasn't until probably halfway through the pregnancy that I really came to see exactly what was going on. But during that time, I'd also done a lot of research into domestic violence because my naive way of thinking was that, I wasn't getting beaten. Of course, I wasn't in a domestic violence relationship.
Yeah.
No one's hitting me.
Yeah.
And so with that gradual gaining of knowledge and the understanding of what constitutes abuse, I started to sort of piece things together. And then it became very apparent to me, literally like a checklist, really, that these things were happening to me. And I probably wasn't in a very safe marriage. And then, from there, it became a process of figuring out how to leave. And that took quite some time to figure out. And it took a very long time to actually get across the line with leaving. But yeah, it was just that initial recognition. And the really sad thing was family and friends had recognized it long before I had, but because of the situation and the way that abuse works, I couldn't see the sort of conversations they were having with me. I couldn't apply them to myself. It's
Right.
almost felt like there was one set of rules for me and a whole different set of rules for everyone else in life.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah,
So I
it's
guess
tricky.
going back to the sort of going back a little bit to the beginning. So how long had at the time of the miscarriage, how long had you been together? How long had your relationship been?
Probably I'll have to guess about maybe a decade, about 10
Wow.
years on and off,
So a
I
long
guess.
time. And so you were saying
Yes.
that his behavior obviously got worse at that time. When you look back, even way back to the beginning, when you first met him, do
Mhm.
you now see, I think sometimes people refer to them as pink flags. Maybe they were red flags, but maybe they were pink flags, you know what I mean? So they were kind of like, oh,
For
that's a
sure.
bit borderline. Do you look back on those early days and can you see some behavior that you now realize, okay, I should have paid attention to those things?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. There was never a point where it wasn't, where there
Mm,
wasn't something evident that things weren't quite right. And I mean, even from the outset, ironically, when I first met him, I couldn't stand him. There was just something about him and my gut instinct that I didn't like.
mm,
And then, yeah, I mean, I can see it all clear as day now, but certainly at the time, there were always excuses. Like, things like not being able to keep a job, and it was always the employer's fault. Never having any money. It was always someone else's fault that he didn't have money.
right.
Being late or not responsible for, a myriad of things. It
Mm,
was always someone else's fault.
yeah.
Um, and then eventually it was always my fault instead of someone
Yeah.
else. It was always my fault. Quitting smoking. It was my fault he couldn't quit smoking.
Right.
It was just like looking back at that, I'm like, that's absolutely
Mm,
baffling how it could
yeah.
possibly be my fault. But yeah, I mean, there was just so many examples that,
Yeah.
yeah, I look back now and I think I knew things weren't quite right at the time, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And eventually
Mm,
I just got convinced it was me.
right. Yeah. At some point was your self-esteem kind of already kind of not so good when you met him, or where were you at?
So I was a very strong-willed, independent, capable, bubbly, outgoing person. And by
Wow.
the time I left, none of that existed. It was all gone.
Wow. And did you sort of early on sort of see him how he dealt with conflict or how he dealt with stress or how he dealt with his own anger that you now see were problematic, or what was that like?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, the binge drinking was one of his coping mechanisms.
Right.
And with that came a Jekyll and Hyde aspect. It was either like a really loving, amazing, caring, tentative person, or it was like violent, throwing things at the wall, tearing things down, abusing me person. So
Mm,
that was always scary. I was always scared when he would drink.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, it was just always someone else's fault. The arguments were initially weren't as bad as they were in the end, but certainly by the end, it was constant. Like
Mm,
maybe every few hours there'd be massive blow-ups. There'd be
wow.
huge arguments. They'd last for like an hour, an hour and a half. And
Yeah.
they'd be what I call circular arguments. So they'd start with a
Yeah.
statement, then there'd be an argument about it. And then just as I was getting to the end of my tether and saying, look, I'm done, he'd repeat the same statement that started the argument, and then he'd try and get it to argue around again.
So he
It was
wanted the
just
argument. He wanted to engage the argument.
yeah, I think there was a part of him, I don't know if it was an enjoyment or if it was feeling like there was worthiness there, but I certainly felt like arguing gave him some sort of fulfilled some sort of need in him
Yeah.
looking back.
Yeah.
It's just quite quite crazy. I don't know how I put up with it for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a common thing. It's so common. So quite often people find themselves in relationships like this because they've experienced it growing up and it's a familiar pattern to them. Sometimes they're also, another scenario is that they're love bombed. So they kind of don't know what they're walking into. What do you have any kind of understanding of yourself around, not that any of it is your fault at all, but do you understand anything about it,
Sure.
about how you got on that path? Because some women will leave very early on and very quickly into that, and some will stay, and quite commonly the ones that stay are often because they've experienced it growing up as a child, and it's a familiar feeling, or they were love bombed. And not that there's only two scenarios, but I'm just wondering, do you have any kind of insight around that for yourself?
Yeah, I totally do. I spent a long time trying to figure out why this happened to me. One of the things that I kept coming back to, well, a few things actually that I kept coming back to. One, I have been all of my life and was raised to be a people pleaser.
Right.
So that meant that it was easy for others to exploit my goodwill and good nature.
Yeah.
The second thing was that I hadn't learned how to set and maintain respectable and fair boundaries. So coupled with people pleasing, it meant that I would do whatever people asked generally, even if it was at an expense or a loss to myself.
Yeah.
And then I think with my ex-husband, he was an exploitive person. So for him, it was handy to have someone who was a people pleaser. So really, when I wanted to keep people pleasing and he wanted to keep exploiting, it was dysfunctionally functional. It worked in a very toxic way. It's taken me a long time to learn how to set, maintain, and be comfortable with boundaries. So it's a work in progress, but I think that was the main thing.
Yeah, and I think that we like to think that we've come a long way since women's liberation in the 60s, but girls and women still have a very strong message that a nice girl or a nice woman is what we should aim to be. And nice is not complaining, not stating your needs, not being demanding, and I kind of feel like we still get these very, very strong messages from society around what a nice woman, what a nice girl is. And, and we get punished with oh, she's a bitch, or she's, and just labeled if we would stand up for ourselves or state what she's a psycho, or whatever it is, because she wouldn't put up with behavior, or because she became emotional as in a response to being poorly treated. So I feel like there's a lot of that happening for women, and this pressure to be nice is definitely still there.
The whole wholesome image, eh?
And I mean, we have 1 in 3 women in New Zealand who experience family violence at some point in their lives. It's a really high statistic, and we have to sort of look at, well, what's contributing to that, and what sort of messages are floating around in society that contribute to that about men and about women. And really challenging some of that. Because that's what our daughters are growing up in, our children are growing up in that environment, our boys are growing up in that environment. So, I guess just kind of coming to the abuse itself, and you described it as emotional abuse and verbal abuse. And I know you mentioned there were other things as well. What kind of impact did that have on you? I mean, you talked about how you started off being this bright, bubbly, strong, independent person, and by the end of it, you were the opposite. So how did it impact you? What changes did you see in yourself in terms of how you felt about yourself, your thoughts, how you behaved? What did you notice?
Well, there was just nothing left of me from what I was before I got into the relationship. And there was a constant undertow of so there was a lot of gaslighting in my relationship too.
Yeah.
So that's where you're made to believe that reality isn't real.
Yeah.
And that had a profound effect on me. I took a long time to trust myself, to trust my memory, and to trust any events that had happened in my recollection. I also found that I was forever apologizing. It didn't matter what it was, I was saying sorry. I was totally unable to figure out the dynamics of communication that was healthy, because I'd been so immersed in a toxic communication environment. I couldn't relay my concerns to anyone because I was so scared of confrontation. It took me a long time to be able to ask for any help. And, I was suddenly a sole parent, and I certainly struggled with the first probably couple of years after I separated. And trying to ask for help was a huge process for me of actually working through all of the preconceived ideas and notions that I had about how I couldn't ask for help, how I had to just suck it up and I wasn't worthy, and actually build to a point where I could say it's okay for me to ask for help, because I really did need help. It was just such a different, like I look at myself now, and I mean, we're several years down the track, and I'm unrecognizable to the person that left. And oddly enough, I wouldn't change it. Despite all that happened, I would not change what happened to me, because I believe that I've learned and grown a lot since then. But it was not without its challenges, and it still remains a challenge. I've got to try and, quote, co-parent with this person. And that's still not easy. There's still abusive dynamics there that will never stop, because I don't think he knows how to function any other way.
And
I honestly think it was just an upbringing thing. I think he was just brought up in a way, or has adapted a way of being, and I don't think he sees anything wrong with his behavior.
So and unless he sees something wrong with it, he's not, and has insight into that, he's not going to have commitment to change. And you really have to have commitment to change if you're going to change. But you have to admit that there's something wrong in the first place. And I think that very thing is the hardest thing of all, because if you admit that you're being verbally abusive or emotionally abusive, that's a very uncomfortable thing to admit. And so quite often they will sit in denial about that, because that's too confronting. And I know you mentioned, kind of things the arguments happening more often, more frequently, and, it's sort of getting faster and faster. And that's kind of, there's a cycle of abuse, which I'm sure you've learned about, but for the sake of our listeners, and especially, when you mentioned that Jekyll and Hyde thing, that's so common. And there's usually this abuse cycle. Anyone can Google it and they'll see, there's this period of calm, or even some people would call the honeymoon period, where things are going well, and that might be where he's being really, really lovely, and that's the bit that usually drags you back in. It kind of pulls you back in, and it would have pulled you in the first place. There's a really nice guy that you really are looking for. It's the ideal guy that you want. And then tension builds. So there's this period where, and quite often that's where your anxiety sits as well, because you know that it's brewing and you can feel the tension in the air. You can feel the tension in him and the strain, and he's just starting to maybe get a bit snappy, and you kind of can feel what's coming. And then you have the explosion. And sometimes some will go on to apologize and before they get onto the honeymoon stage again. Some will not apologize and not ever take responsibility at all. But regardless, that cycle just goes around. And the longer you stay in it, the faster and faster that cycle goes, to the point where people start to be physically in danger. And which is why we have so many women who are killed through intimate partner violence, because that cycle gets faster and faster and they're more and more in danger. For you, what led you to leave? Because like as you say, you had gaslighting, so you were being blamed, and you'd got to that point where you believed what you were being told, but you're also confused, because often when you're being gaslit, there's this almost like this really bizarre confusion, because it's like you've got your own reality hasn't disappeared. You can kind of vaguely see it. Mm-hmm. And there's the reality that they're sort of saying to you. And that kind of it just creates this really bizarre, confused feeling, which I would say probably a little bit like sitting in a fog. And a confusion about what to do or what's true, what is true. And so for you, what did lead to you leaving? Because it's such a big step to make, even though you're saying, I don't know why I stayed for so long. He had been gaslighting you for a really long time, and that, and your self-esteem was being kind of worn away. And that was why you stayed for so long. But I'm just curious to know what led to you leaving.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And you're right, it's one of the hardest parts to do in any relationship that's got domestic violence factors, and it's also the most riskiest time.
Yes.
What led to me leaving? For me, it was there was one night where everything had escalated quite quickly and had gotten very, very tense very fast. And I had spent the night sleeping in the bedroom with my children, and I didn't sleep a wink because I was too terrified that he may hurt us. And I'd actually sent a message to my friends that night saying, look, if anything happens to me or the children, please get the information to the police that they need to thoroughly investigate my then husband. And I had said, please know that I love the children, I'd never hurt them. And then I think when I woke up the next morning, I had some messages from my friends checking to see if I was okay and what was going on. And I think it might have just been enough of a jolt for me to realize that this was like way out of the realms of normal. And if I didn't do something soon, one of us, the kids or me, one of us was going to end up not surviving this. And that just wasn't an option. I couldn't leave the children with no mother, and I couldn't bear loss of a child. So yeah, I reached out to my friends, bless them. They sent me a whole heap of resources and information for getting safe. And I reached out to Women's Refuge, and it took a while. It was still probably another 6 months after that before I finally actually got up the courage to physically leave. But I started packing bags. I started storing stuff at my parents' house. I had told them that things weren't good when I was sort of about 20 weeks pregnant with my youngest. And so they were very on board with helping me. And I started just basically whittling away at getting things out, getting them to a safe space, making an exit plan. And then I went and saw a lawyer, and I said to the lawyer, this is what's happening. I need help. And the lawyer helped me draft court orders for without notice protection orders. And and then while I was waiting for those to be processed, I was terrified that somehow he was going to find out. And we just happened to have an argument one night, and it was just, that was it. I just couldn't do it anymore. And so I got my bags and I put the kids in the car and I left. And I never looked back. It was
Yeah.
hands down the best thing I ever did. Even in that moment, as I drove away, I knew I wasn't going back, and I knew that I was finally going to
Yeah.
be free.
Yeah.
And it was just so much relief.
Yeah. So, from this experience, I mean, gosh, we could have another whole episode on post leaving and, the being a sole parent and, all of that stuff. Because that's massive, and, starting from scratch on your own and all of that stuff, because often that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to leave, right, is to kind of this overwhelming feeling of doing this on my own and not really having a lot of confidence, leaving with your self-esteem in the gutter, and not necessarily having the support, because, and some relationships, and I don't know if yours was like this, some relationships, the partner is really tried to isolate the person from their supports, whether that's friends or family. So when it does come time to leave, it's like, it can feel overwhelming.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and also there's financial stuff, like, especially if you've got young children and and you don't have a job, or so massive amounts of things that we could spend weeks kind of talking about. But I guess in terms of steps around steps that you took, you said you went to a lawyer. Were you able to find legal aid, or did you know how to navigate that? Or did you were able to afford it?
No, gosh, no, I couldn't afford it. No, my first port of call was Women's Refuge, and from there they enabled access to lawyers. They gave me an IRD / WINS representative who could help me figure out what I would be entitled to financially. They helped me set me up with some extra clothes for the kids. There was the option to move into a safe house if I needed it. Their whole resource network was just incredible, and I was very, very thankful for my representative. She was amazing.
That's so good.
And I just want to say, just for anyone that is listening, Women's Refuge aren't solely about making sure you leave. They're there even if you want to stay in that relationship. They just want to keep you safe and give you safe plans in place for how that's going to look. I stayed with my then husband for a good few months, probably 6 to 8. Actually, no, it must have been more than that. It would probably be about a year before I finally left. And they were totally on board with me being at the point that I was and supporting me through that. So you don't have to go and feel forced to leave. It's just keeping you safe while navigating all of that.
That's really helpful, Emma, because as you were saying, it takes a while to leave, and in fact, it's helpful to have a good plan, about how you're going to do that and to put those supports in place.